Comrades, the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign was formally initiated really about a month after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it arose actually out of a discussion amongst three of us: Cheryl, a comrade in France, Olivier Delbic, and myself. And the discussions were revolved around trying to understand and figure out the reactions of the socialist left towards that invasion and what had led up to the invasion. And we should just remember that in the weeks prior to the invasion, when Biden was warning that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine, and just about the entire socialist left just mechanically repeated what Putin was saying, that Biden was just warmongering. Then, of course, after he did, that Putin actually did invade, the socialist left completely dropped the fact that they had been saying Putin was not going to invade, and they went on to repeat the other Putin lies about the invasion was denazification, and then since then the invasion was all about NATO. And we had seen something similar in regard to much of the socialist left in regard to Syria, where they repeated that the U.S. Involvement, that basically what the counter-revolution in Syria was just a repetition of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And it wasn't only socialists, even serious journalists like Jonathan Pilger were basically saying the same thing. And also, similar to what they're doing still to this day regarding Ukraine, they just deplatformed or completely ignored and wrote out of existence the voices of the Syrian people themselves. And also a sub-theme was every uncomfortable fact, every development that didn't match their preconception was just fake news and the US lies of the US media and so on. That tendency as far as Syria became even more widespread as far as Ukraine. None of them to this day has bothered to seek out or listen to the voices of Syrian workers and the Syrian left itself. Just to give one example, a comrade that I had, a longtime comrade of mine that I always saw as, and I still do see as far as his path, as an extremely thoughtful and well-informed comrade. When I challenged him and others as far as not listening to any of the voices of Ukrainian people, he said, "Oh no, that's not true. I listened to Barotba." Well, Barotba is just or was just the voice of Putin. And so I want to make one point as far as the method and the use of why, when we first organized this group, we decided to use the term socialist in the name of our group, Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. And I've long felt that the socialist movement in the United States has really cut itself off from the working class here at home. And of course, if you're cut off from your own working class, you're going to be cut off from the working class internationally also. And in this case, we're talking about Syria and also Ukraine. And also, I think it's clear that a new socialist movement has to be born out of the ashes of the old. You can't just have a reform of the current socialist movement that basically, that is hugely influenced by Putin and company. And we never had any illusions that our tiny little group, the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign, that we could be the reborn socialist movement, that we could be the force that would organize it. I think that a reborn, healthy, working class oriented socialist movement will have to come out of the objective events. But that doesn't mean that we don't encourage and try to whatever extent we can to help that rebirth. And the basic method, I think, has to be to not to start with what we want, but to start with the objective situation. How different objective forces, that is to say, forces that are beyond our control, will tend to interact and develop. And then out of that, what's necessary and possible. And as socialists, we believe that what is necessary and possible in the long term is socialism. Not because it's prettier or more just or even what we want, but because it's the only possible necessity. Doesn't mean, incidentally, that and it's, in other words, it's the only possible outcome that can resolve the crisis that human society is facing, which incidentally, that doesn't necessarily mean it will result from that, but that's a different question. But also, it's inadequate to just pose what we believe is a long-term solution, because a lot of people do that in order to ignore what has to be done right here and now. So what also I think has to distinguish working class socialists is what are the immediate steps along that road that can and have to be taken. And I think that the role of our group can be that we have to help clarify, help the movement develop along that road, but also help to clarify things. And so with that in mind, the first task that we took up initially upon the initial formation of the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign was to try to figure out what had happened in the socialist movement and why. And in particular, how it came to be that the broad layers of the socialist movement had taken up ideas of the extreme right, including ideas of fascism. And those of you who've been around, since the formation, will remember that we had of our group, will remember that we had a series of discussions on exactly that question, on what prepared the soil for the sprouting of these right-wing ideas within the socialist movement, and what were the connections, the actual links between people from the extreme right and layers of the socialist movement. Also, we were the first group to actually realize and discuss the importance of Neville Roy Singham in that whole process. Since then, we've had a series of other discussions on Syria, on the oil industry, on India with Kavita Krishnan. We had several Ukrainian speakers, and I'm sure I'm forgetting other important discussions we've had. Maybe others will want to remind us, but that's been an important feature of our activity, is regular, serious, in-depth political discussions. But also I want to say that we cannot play the role that we've set out for ourselves to play. We cannot really understand things simply by reading and talking. That where possible, we have to get involved in the actual movement itself, where such a movement exists. And if it's not possible, then at least try to communicate with and listen to wider layers of workers and youth. And for a tiny group, we have been very, very active. And after this, I think Cheryl is going to go through some of our activities. But through those activities, we sharpen up our understanding, including how to phrase things, what to emphasize, and so on. And also, we learn from even the most new participants in the struggle to change society. Now, up until October 7th, there was almost what you could call a political desert, at least here in the United States, with very, very little actual political activity. There was some online, including like through Twitter and Instagram and so on. But that's actually, I believe, quite limited.
John, that's 10 minutes.
Thanks, Cheryl. But now a new movement has sprung to life around the issue of Israel and Palestine. In one sense, it exhibits some of the same problems as the old movements have, in that what I've seen, and I think this is true elsewhere, is that the movement in the streets, the protests and so on in the streets, are organized and controlled by two main groups. One is the old Putin apologist left, and the other are the NGOs. And but there is, in my limited experience, there is a lot of opening for us to bring in our ideas. For instance, in the big protests in San Francisco that I went to a couple of weeks ago, there was a group of young students carrying signs about Xinjiang in China and relating that to Gaza. Also, I found a lot of openness to discussing the connection between Gaza and Ukraine. So Ukraine is not now a central issue of
eventually it'll be collected.
The question of Gaza and Palestine, but it is central to the movement as a whole, in this sense that if this movement, which is basically a single issue movement, if it will broaden out, and if it will in part lead to the development of a new socialist movement, one that's truly oriented to the working class, or at least some section of it, it's going to have to broaden out beyond just one single issue. And the entire basis for it must be international working class solidarity. And incidentally, that's a very practical issue for workers in the United States in a global economy. But you cannot deal with international working class solidarity if you ignore the issue of Ukraine. And so that's why I believe that we must, from the start, find some way to raise the issue of Ukraine within this movement around Israel and Palestine. And incidentally, Cheryl and I had several discussions several weeks ago in which I was somewhat skeptical about directly raising the issue of Ukraine, and Cheryl was kind of insisting on it. And when I went to the protests in San Francisco, I was convinced that Cheryl was right about that. Now, another issue is how to relate to the Democratic Party. And incidentally, the entire left misses this question. Some those linked with the non-profiteers support the Democrats, although they don't want to say so. Others support Jill Stein, which in my opinion is a complete contradiction with international working class solidarity. And therefore, I think that we have to oppose that. So we will have our ability, the openings for us to raise our ideas within this movement, I think will be somewhat limited because of the undemocratic nature of how this movement is organized. And I think that that's one issue that we have to raise. But I think also, but where we do get to speak, I think we have to raise this issue. And also where we don't, I think there's a real opening to distributing some leaflets. And I think some of the points that we have to raise is, one, if we oppose some imperialist occupations, we must oppose them all. Also, that the calls for a ceasefire are inadequate. And I think that we have to call for a total end of Israel's occupation of both Gaza and the West Bank, lock, stock, and barrel. But if you oppose this imperialist occupation, you have to oppose Russia's occupation of Ukraine. And also, if we are against racism and oppression, then we have to be against the racism and oppression of Palestinians inside of Israel itself. Also, as I said, I think that we need to call for the movement to be run on democratic lines with organizing committees, opportunity for all pro-Palestine voices to be heard, including those of genuine, full international working class solidarity, meaning linking solidarity with Palestine to solidarity with Ukraine. Now, in my opinion, and we do have to start to raise the issue of the Democratic Party and building an independent working class movement outside of and opposed to the Democratic Party, which means an organization, which can only mean at some point a working class political party. And I think that this is my own personal opinion, and I know that there will be others who will disagree with this. That's fine. But I think that there is an opening, and we should use this opening to start to raise the idea of independent working class candidates running at the local level, which I don't think that the movement would be capable of doing anything beyond that, but raising that for 2024. Now, the last point, there's been some discussion and disagreement regarding having voted for Biden in 2020. And whatever the view is, in 2024, it's a bit different in some ways from having voted for Biden in 2020. But in any case, regarding 2024, we must not ignore the extremely serious threat that Donald Trump and the Republican Party poses, which incidentally, if you didn't like what he did in 2016, what he did in 2016 will appear like child's play compared to what his plans are if he gets back in 2024. And the present movement is forgetting that. And whether or not anybody plans to vote for Biden in 2024, we have to remind people of the serious threat that Trump raises. For instance, for him, the Heritage Foundation is too establishment and too much the quote deep state. He's proposed using the Insurrection Act to bring the troops out into the street. He's called the left opponents of his the vermin, which is, as people have reminded others, that's a reminder of, that's a type of term that Hitler and Mussolini used, well, Hitler in particular used to use. He's proposed expelling all undocumented immigrants. You're talking about, at least for a start, hundreds of thousands, expelling them from the United States, starting with putting them in what amounts to concentration camps. And even regarding Palestine, the Republicans actually favor starting a war with Iran. And we must not also forget Trump's Muslim ban in 2016 when he first came into office. And it will be worse if he gets back in 2024. So how we relate to that, I think there'll be need for further discussion. It's not something that we're going to resolve here this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where you are. But how we relate to that will need further discussion. But I do believe that we must not minimize or ignore this very real threat. So with that, I'll finish for now. Thank you very much.